Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Caroline Rule, Associate Director for LM Counseling and International Careers for the Office of Career Strategy at Penn Law. I'd like to welcome Nathan Peart, a Managing Director of the Associate Practice Group of Major Lindsey in Africa. Major Lindsey in Africa is a premier global legal executive search firm, and he will provide us with a legal industry insight into the UK legal market, Europe, and the Middle East. The webinar will be recorded, and we ask students to put questions into the question and answer and into Xylo, and we'll answer them at the end of the program. Nathan, thank you so very much for joining us today, and I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan Peart. I'm Managing Director in the London office of Major Lindsey in Africa. So just brief background and context. I've been at MLA for nearly 10 years. I started in London office and I spent time in between working and living in Hong Kong and New York. And now I'm back in London here. And we cover the whole of Europe and the Middle East from our office here. So hopefully some of the insight we built from working these markets will be useful for you today. As mentioned, we've got the Q&A that you can, tap questions into. I also use Slido, which is a website. Just go on and type in this code. You can just post questions with your name or anonymously throughout the presentation, and we can pick those up at the end, or we can use it at the end to do Q&A as well. All super casual. Hopefully technology works. Any question, no big or small, please feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to give you a good answer. Why does all of this matter? Why are we having this presentation? Why are we talking about choosing a practice area if you want to think about coming to London at some point? Well, actually, it does take a lot of planning in some respects. And, our goal is to really share this information so that you can be on the right path early on in your career and figure out, what sort of things you want to do and set some goals around that. We've used this slide before, but I think it really just highlights, why it's really difficult to change practice areas once you start practicing and once you go into your career. You want to choose something you're really passionate about and interested in, and balance that with some of your goals, some of the realities of your situation on the market, and everything like that. You see some of these experiences here. People are dissatisfied with their practice area, other people kind of feel like they've missed the boat on certain things. And these are just some of those experiences that people had that we think are just kind of worth highlighting to sort of set the scene. So let's give some kind of deeper context here, particularly for international relocations. It's never too early to start thinking about and planning your career. Certainly, even my experiences, and I think this is the same for everybody, you're going to have a plan and things change, and that's okay. The things can go off-piste and you can end up in different places. I certainly never expected to, spend time living in Hong Kong or New York, and those opportunities came my way. But, you fall into things sometimes, but it's good to have a rough plan and start thinking about what does my life look like? Where do I want to be? What's important to me? The more you can get comfortable with those questions and think about it, the better. So let's start with some real fundamentals about how you're going to choose your practice area. And then later we'll look at the specifics of each market and why they kind of tie in, and it's important to make informed decisions now. So you have generalist practice areas like corporate, which consists of M&A, capital markets, whole range of different things. Sometimes finance is slotted in there, sometimes its own thing. And obviously within the finance world, you've got leverage finance, acquisition finance, asset finance, structured finance. All of these things, certainly in the big law context, firms will operate and work in. We've also got niche practice areas. So I was trying to think about these earlier, and I think things like IP litigation and tax, they're very, very specific, often jurisdictional specific as well. And that's really important to think about for any international move, because if you're advising on US tax law, very, very rarely is that going to be needed as a skill set in a foreign market. Although I never say never, and I did have a search last year looking for a US tax associate to come to London. So, again, never say never, but it is very niche, and it means that those opportunities are less likely than, say, a corporate practice area. Only certain practice areas lend themselves to relocation, as we said, and that is because you've got to think about, why is somebody going to hire me, right? When you've done a few years of in practice and you're kind of thinking about, where do I go next? Why is somebody going to pay for me to move across the world or move to a different location? As much as your drivers might be there, it comes back to the same reason that people rarely switch practice areas, because if you are looking for a 2 or 3 year M&A lawyer, you're not going to want a 5th year litigator to make a switch, regardless of what the skill set is. It's too much of a risk. And people want, to hire quickly, to advance their business, advance their practice. And that's really why, certain practices lend themselves to moving overseas, and it's hard to switch practice areas. Other thing to think about, particularly, being an international student, for example, on LM program or JD program or whatever, is the visa situation in the US and other markets as well. This can apply to. We've seen people go through that process and not being successful at visas, and then have to find other routes into practice. I've been through the US visa process myself, and I understand it's complex and it's ever changing, and you need to think about those things. How long can I stay here? What if something switches, and what if something changes? The other broader question to think about is, what travels well? And it goes back to the generalist versus niche practice. Why would a firm cover the cost of relocation? Essentially, the answer is they want your expertise working in a practice area in the United States, and they can take that business model and bring it to Europe in this example, and leverage that client base here to generate more revenue for the firm. And that's really what it comes down to. It is very, very fundamental core of why these practices exist. So I'm going to dive in and start with London, because that's quite a key market for EMEA, and just give you some context here and some ideas that hopefully will be useful if you're thinking about this sort of move. So let's just kind of do a brief overview of the market. London's a very, very busy market, and it's kind of in two strands, really. You have the local domestic market, where you have people going through our training contract system who are qualified in England and Wales, and you have the same sort of practice areas you do in the US, but at a local level. You also then have a kind of US bubble market, and that typically has been capital markets focused, but you also get a bit of M&A, a bit of private equity, and a bit of finance, excuse me, within that. The market generally has been very, very hot for US firms over the past couple of years. They have been in London for quite a few years now. When I first started here, there was a lot of lateral partner movement, and we've really seen that filter down into the associate ranks, where, some of the bigger firms are comparable in terms of size to the Magic Circle, which is where locally trained associates have usually kind of been the cream of the crop. Talking about kind of what practices are open to US qualified attorneys. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really capital markets, high yield debt capital markets is the bread and butter of the US attorney sort of practice group, really, in London. There are examples and a few firms that also do a bit of M&A and private equity. Some firms have a mixed practice, so they do capital markets and M&A, but that really is kind of the core of the US market here. There's probably about 100, 120 US partners serving those practices in the London market across all of the AmLaw 5,100 firms that have a presence in London. And so it still is relatively small as a group. The other thing that's interesting is they often serve as a European hub. So regardless if a firm have a local office in, say, Paris or Frankfurt, and we'll talk about those markets in a moment, often London is the hub that connects to New York and also serves the rest of the European client base. Talking a little bit about Brexit and how that ties in with EMEA, we'll see how all of that develops. Quite frankly, it's there's firms developing Brexit practices, there's firms opening in Dublin. Dublin is becoming a hot tech hub. We are seeing a bit of US tech come through. It's a really kind of changing market. The only hindrance it does have, or change, I guess, is if you hold a European passport, prior to Brexit, you could easily work here. You didn't need a visa, and now you need a visa. Luckily, we work on a point system now, and lawyers at the moment are in that kind of in need category. So we haven't had problem with visas, but it is something just to think about again, that's a changing landscape and things that you can't control and that you should sort of think about. So when I was thinking about, okay, practice areas, what's hot, what's happening in the market right now, so people kind of get a sense of things, both at the kind of local system level and US level. You know, certainly the US practices are busy in hiring. The pandemic saw a lot of people return home. So, you know, we worked with people moving back to New York or back to California or Chicago, or wherever it is. And the same movement, people actually came back to London or to close to family here. It's quite similar really to the US. It's a corporate finance practices are super, super hot. You know, have a bit of work going on in arbitration and real estate right now. And then things like litigation, employment, energy, you know, they're quieter practices here. And I think what this really kind of shows and tells you is that it's the big transactional practices that are always going to have work and always going to have opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that you should just choose them for the sake of it. You know, I really believe that you've got to do work that you love and you're passionate about. But do remember, if you want, you know, what's my exit option? What am I going to do? How am I going to get to London? You know, transactional practices, working with big corporates, big banks, there is need for that work wherever you go. And that can be your ticket to another location often. If we look at the outlook of the market as well, you know, it's a very strong market. London continues to be so. We had tremendous growth, particularly with the US firms, tons of hiring, even with Brexit, even with the pandemic. You know, we are lucky in our qualification system that it is different to the US, that we don't need that, the bar exam isn't as heavy here. And so we take from a lot of kind of Commonwealth markets, like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India. It's a really kind of varied, rich market in terms of talent pool. Junior opportunities exist. You know, we do work with candidates who have just finished LLM or, you know, graduates who can find their way into practices. Because we have a training contract that's 2 years on the US side, you know, there's often a lot of opportunity. The key really is to making sure you're admitted to the bar. You know, do a bar exam when you graduate, even the LLM, and make sure that you can get that admission, because that's really, really going to help. Nationality is a major issue in terms of visas. It's visas for everyone who don't hold a British passport, so that's fine. Qualification requirements, interesting. People ask me about, you know, will I sit the local bar? And actually, you probably won't. We have an exam called the SQE, which is the, I know exactly better. I think it's the solicitor qualifying exam. It's just changed. It used to be QLTS, but it takes into account some of your working experience. But back to that two-strand market, you know, if you've got a JD or a US LLM and a US bar, you're really going to be focused on those US practices. They pay the best. They're going to be aligned with the work that you want to do and that you've built experience in or want to build experience in. So it makes a lot of sense. And that leads nicely then into compensation. You know, there is a difference between, really between firms in London. You know, not every US firm pays the same rates they do in New York or, you know, wherever else as they do in London. Some do, you know, like Kirkland, Latham typically pay on the New York scale in London. But there are other firms that pay below that have a banding system. Local firms, you know, Magic Circle pay a lot less than the US firms here. And then even the sort of smaller, you know, either boutique or smaller national firms pay kind of, you know, at least half of what a big US firm does. So you really want to focus on those US practices where you can, because that's going to give you the best kind of bang for your buck, really, of where you've built your experience and everything like that. London very much follows, you know, like any other international city, the flexibility around working. You know, we're really seeing a kind of 2 or 3 day a week hybrid pattern. We are sort of more opened up now. It's you know, anecdotally, because we're not a state system like you have in the US, it is, you know, uniform. We have devolved nations. Don't need to go into, because it really is London going to be your main focus. And so there's usually consistency there on what's happening in terms of mask mandates and everything like that. But this hybrid working situation is anticipated to kind of remain here for the foreseeable future. Relocation timeline and everything like that usually takes a couple of months to come over. Firms will pay for your relocation as well. Any kind of exam fees, I never encourage people to do like the SQE or anything on their own. I think it's really, you know, a firm is comfortable sponsoring that through their learning and development programs, and you shouldn't really put yourself out of pocket for the possibility of making an international move. You know, usually relocation packages are either a flat fee rate of X, you know, X £1,000, it varies firm to firm, or they will, you know, book everything for you, like flights, excess baggage. One difference to London actually is that you often get temporary accommodation, which you don't typically get when you move to the US. And that's nice. It's usually for about a month in a service apartment, and just gives you time to get into the market, figure out where you want to live, get set up and settle down. You know, it's a nice kind of perk and feature of what you get in London. On the vaccine point, we've you know, had a national rollout of vaccine and booster programs and everything like that. We obviously have a national health service here, and that's a free at point of entry healthcare system. Often firms will also provide private health insurance as well, so you can get best of both systems. But that's a different feature to certainly what you would get in the US. Any questions on that, please put them in the Slido or in the chat box, and we can address those later on. So I'll move on nicely now to Europe and the Middle East. I'll just take a pardon me. So where can you go in the rest of Europe and the Middle East? And actually, I should have put. I realised just as I said that I've missed a point off there in terms of Dubai. So I'll start with Dubai. Dubai is a market that's available to US attorneys. Much smaller US practices there, but the same sort of situation exists as it does in London. It's obviously a tax-free jurisdiction. And I've had candidates who want to make that move over to the Middle East. Abu Dhabi as well is also a market, but usually people looking in that market have a personal tie. That's often what I've found, and want to move there for personal reasons more than anything. But they do exist. In terms of where else in Europe, so Paris, Madrid, Frankfurt or Munich for Germany, and Amsterdam are kind of the most popular markets. So typically you need language skills for these markets to really succeed. They're less busy for US attorneys, and what you are finding are a smaller handful of firms that instead of having London as their base and operating the whole of Europe, they'll have US capital markets practices in each of those cities serving, you know, those markets specifically. So maybe it's the Spanish banks or French corporates or something like that. You typically find you'll have less choice than, say, the London kind of hub, and you do need language fluency often. So I've placed people in, you know, sort of markets like Madrid who have Spanish language skills, placements in Paris, and it's mostly been in capital markets in terms of like locating practice area and that kind of heavy debt work. People often ask me about Switzerland, you know, if they've had partners that work there or something like that. The Swiss legal market is really, really different. I'm not an expert by any means in it at all, but it is a very different market. It's dominated by local Swiss firms. They do have, you know, use for US lawyers' expertise, but your best bet really for those markets is to go direct. They have a lot of regulation around recruiting, and it's a very different kind of market to the rest of Europe. So I thought that was worth flagging as well. So yeah, in kind of summary, in terms of outlook, you know, Europe's in some ways a less popular market because you typically need language skills. You also then obviously have visa requirements and everything like that. And the practices tend to be smaller, so that the opportunities or needs aren't as great as you might get in London. I think you see fewer opportunities for newly qualified lawyers there, unless you sort of have got those language skills. Maybe you've got some experience at a local firm prior to that. And again, in some respects, similar to London for post-LLM candidates, there are select opportunities for sure. It's just a harder market to crack. And I think if you can spend some time maybe in London first, or the US, I think that helps you as well. Expat packages tend to vary. They're sometimes not as generous as you would get in London because they're not necessarily aligned to New York. People might move for lifestyle reasons or something like that, and that's factored into it as well. If you look at sort of market rates on some of the big US firms, there's a good sort of 30-40% difference sometimes between their European office and what they pay in somewhere like New York. So that's worth thinking about as well. Again, working from home, flexibility, all of that is very normal. I think in every market now, we typically find that firms will follow kind of the norm and just do what their kind of head office is doing or everything like that. So I don't see any kind of problems there. So to sum up, really, I mean, Europe, Middle East, there are opportunities. They're fewer and far between, and often you need sort of language skills or a tie to really make those options work. And you're probably better going when you've got some decent experience under your belt, kind of as like a third year plus, rather than as a kind of graduate or kind of new attorney. I think you'd be better looking at London for that kind of thing. So we've obviously done well on time. I have got a couple of questions here, which I'll address in a moment. This Scan Me area, we have a student toolkit that you can just scan, and these slides will be up and it's recorded so you can access that later, but it's just got some interview guides and things like that we thought would be helpful to sort of show you. So I'll start with the questions here, and then I'll jump onto the Slido and see if there's anything there and kind of click back and forth. So is there a need for US trained lawyers to work in international arbitration? How does London compare to Paris for international arbitration? Really, really great question. Yeah, I've made a couple of US lawyer placements actually recently into international arbitration practice in London. The main firm really is Wilmer Hale. They're the ones that are most interested in US attorneys. Quinn as well are the sort of dominant in this space. It's not as popular. And I think that's for a few reasons. London is a really strong international arbitration center on its own. So again, if you think about why am I going to hire somebody, why do I need to pay US rates, cost of living allowance, potentially visa costs, when I can just go to a Magic Circle firm next door and get an international arbitration lawyer? So they do exist and it is possible, but it is a harder move to make. There are fewer opportunities and they're mostly concentrated at big US firms and at some of the boutiques. It's a great practice area though. How does it compare to Paris or London? That's an interesting question. They're different markets. Again, I think you can work in Paris in the international arbitration space without language skills sometimes, but French fluency is definitely beneficial. Again, from my view of things, I think you typically see more of the opportunities at some of the kind of Silver Circle, Magic Circle firms than at US firms. And then I think you need to sort of think then about, really whether it makes sense from a compensation standpoint for you. So I hope that answers your question, and please ask if you need further clarification. Second one, speak briefly about differences in interview style for London compared to the US. Yeah, this is a really great question. So it is different in some ways. I mean, obviously, if you're joining US practice, you're having US partners interview you, but with a bit of a London style. I think because the teams are smaller and more lean, than you would get in New York in terms of size, then there's a focus on fit, but there's also a focus on technical ability. And so I think you're more likely to get some questions around, technical competencies, how you would do something on a deal, how you would react to a certain, clause or something like that. They are going to ask those kind of questions. it is also a slower process. I think one of the things I really noticed coming back from New York is that, things do take a little bit longer. There is, people aren't as quick. I think it's a working style thing. It's just slightly different. Maybe it's a cultural thing. And often I'll say to candidates, no news is good news, and that can be really frustrating. But sometimes the timeline is longer than you would anticipate and that you might get in the US. That can be down to work. That can be down to, they'll often interview and then discuss at the next partner meeting, which can happen in a week or 2 weeks, if everything's getting cancelled. And you don't often get that visibility as a candidate. And so, I think interviews tend to be a bit more technical and a bit more drawn out. The other interesting thing to note too is offer letters. Our offer letters are longer. Sometimes it can be 10 pages plus. There's a lot of detail in them, a lot of policy. We have 3-month notice periods in the UK. In US practices, they tend to be a little bit shorter, like 1 month or 2, but they still have to adhere to local employment law regulations. We don't have at-will employment in the UK. And that's, actually my understanding is more extreme than that in Europe. I think it's there's even more kind of protection for employees there. So they are different, and it does seem like a lot to read through and kind of figure out. But again, that's where either a recruiter or HR contact someone can kind of help you with those questions. But I thought it was definitely worth noting. So I just switched to the Slido slide here and just see. So I'm just moving my thing. So yeah, if you can keep asking questions, if you want to ask anything, they'll pop up here. Would you recommend American JDs interested in London market directly go to London after law school, or practice a few years in the US first? Great question. I think it really depends. I don't think you're limited either way, to be honest, specifically for London and New York, because you're getting great training in both. I think any international move really has to be driven by, what you want to do, right? Like, how soon do you want to move? Where do you want to live? What's your life situation? You're going to get great training and great development in London. Teams are smaller, so you're probably going to be more hands-on. The difficulty is that in a few years, and I've had candidates have this who have spent a big chunk of their career in London, they end up doing a lot of debt capital markets, high yield work, for example. And then when they go back to the US, those capital markets practices tend to be wider. And so occasionally they might get discounted a class year or something like that. I wouldn't overthink it. Again, I think it has to be just driven by what you want to do and everything like that. I think it really just depends on the person and what your drivers are. I don't think there's a negative. I think if you can go to London straight away and it's what you want to do, you should. But equally, training for a few years in New York is not a bad thing. I think I've really messed up this question thing, having like 5 forms of chat, so I'm sorry. I'm getting through them all as I see, and I'll get this one off. But someone's asked, with regards to compensation, despite the pre-tax pay difference, do you see that take-home pay is relatively comparable after tax and cost of living differences in New York and London? Really interesting question. I'll try and talk through my own personal experiences. The sort of too long don't read answer is it's all relative to where you live. Is really the answer. If I take my experience in Hong Kong, for example, I could get a taxi for like a few dollars to the other side of the island, which was amazing. But my rent was the same as New York, but I got like the size of a closet for an apartment. In London, the tube is more expensive than the subway in New York because it's tiered depending on zone, but it's a lot cleaner and safer than the subway, I think. The benefit of London really is the cost of living allowance. Once you've got some experience under your belt, and especially in capital markets world, you get an extra $60,000 to $80,000 on top of your New York compensation. And the reason for that is partly because of tax, because as a US citizen, you're liable for tax wherever you live in the world, and that as a British citizen, I wasn't. That's not applicable to me. So that was part of it. But it's kind of, the market has shifted so much that it got competitive, and actually that money is on top of what you earn, and it's almost an expat allowance. It is just different city to city. It's hard to put a finger on it. I mean, I think if anecdotally, and for what my experience was, for what it's worth, like I said, like I love the fact the subway was like a couple of dollars and you could go anywhere. I thought food was more expensive in the US. What else was different? I like the speed of things in the US, though. Things moved quickly and just kind of people got on with it. I think in London there tends to be a bit of a kind of English sensibility about things. It takes forever to get anything done. That's annoying. Yeah, it all just varies. I mean, entertainment, social things are the same. You're in a big city, gyms cost about the same as they do anywhere. Leisure activities. London's a spread out city, so typically you will commute in. It's not uncommon to have an hour or even longer commutes. I actually live out in Oxford, and my train's like 50 minutes to get into London, so that's different. Yeah, it really just kind of varies. Just checking the chat. In my experience, is it easier to move abroad in-house or look for a new firm in London? Yeah, another brilliant question. Definitely a law firm. Again, coming back to this question, which I think you always have to ask yourself is, why is somebody going to hire me? There's a lot of people on the ground already, both in US practices and English practices, that want to move in-house. And so, from that perspective, law firms have deep pockets, and they will, pay for your relocation. It's less competitive in some respects. You might as well get some on-the-ground experience and then try and leverage that for a move in-house than try and move directly to a company. It's not impossible, but it is harder to do. If I want to be marketable in common law Asian countries, what should I consider in terms of working in the UK versus the US? Is there more overlap because the legal system is more similar between the UK and the Asian countries? Yeah, that's interesting. And again, those US practices exist in Asia as well, right? There are a few firms that have US capital markets practices in Singapore, for example. If you wanted to be like an IP lawyer, you're probably better trying to come to the UK and qualifying here, with the then view to moving to Asia, because yes, that overlap exists because of common law system, and there's more familiarity in terms of legal system between UK, Hong Kong, and Singapore versus the US. Having said that, if you look at South Korea, for example, that's a split market. You have local firms, you have international firms. All of the international firms are staffed and work under US law. So it very much depends on the market you want to go. I think my quick advice to you would be to look up some partner profiles in the market you want to be in, see what their career journey was, and that's going to be indicative of what's best for you, and depending on what sort of practice area you want to do and everything like that. I've got a few more. I'm just going to clear these. Is there a recruiting cycle or season within the year? Does it vary for junior level hires? There isn't really. I don't think there's any major pattern. Obviously, some of it depends on the market, and obviously, if you're graduating, you want to factor in when you're going to start, and that's usually a sort of September time. I know there are London offices that recruit from LLM programs in the US. If it's later on in your career, if you're lateraling in, as a second or third year, again, it's when it's best for you to make that move. You see a lot of movement after bonus season, obviously. But throughout the year, when you're making that move abroad, you've got to think first, like, can I actually do this? Is myself, is my partner, is my family, are they ready to do this? And it's hard because you don't know until you've got an offer on the table, but you do really kind of want to figure that out in terms of your own timing. Is it easier to move to London within a firm after having worked in New York than it is to look for a new firm in London? I'd say yes, actually, yes. I think if you can get 2 or 3 years in New York of experience building up a corporate capital markets, maybe a bit of M&A, that works too. That's going to give you a lot of leverage to come into the London market, because firms do recruit directly at the junior level in their US practices. So those opportunities are fewer than at the mid level. Again, this point of what do we need? I need to be able to staff deals with associates and understand what they're doing. And so having that experience in New York is really, really powerful, and traditionally is where there's been a lot of movement and appetite from firms to recruit. I mean, at the minute the market's really strange, but that's where we've seen the most opportunity in the past. Any other questions right now? Otherwise we can wrap up, but I'll give it sort of a couple of seconds to see if anyone else has anything else to type. But I think we might be done.
Well, thank you so very much, Nathan. That was such a comprehensive overview of the UK, Europe, as well as MENA. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you again. And I don't believe there's any other questions.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate everyone's time. And yeah, any questions, feel free to drop me an email too. I'm always happy to do my best to answer. Oh, have we got one more?
No, I think it's just a thank you.
Oh, that's fine. No problem.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Nathan.
Stay well.
Bye-bye.